What if one of the most advanced winter survival systems ever created existed long before modern heating, before insulation, before a single machine was ever built to keep a human being warm? We tend to imagine survival on the Great Plains as one endless war against the cold. Wind that never stops, nights that never end, a land that seems designed to break anyone foolish enough to stay. In the stories we've inherited, winter is always the enemy, a force to be fought, a force to be endured, a force that must be defeated just to live until morning. But what if that entire way of thinking is wrong? Here is something history rarely lets us sit with. When settlers came onto these plains, they arrived with iron, with timber, with tools, with firearms, with everything their world called progress. And still, winter after winter, many of them froze to death in the dark. Yet all around them lived families who owned almost none of these things, who carried their entire home on their backs, who moved with the seasons instead of building walls against them. And those families survived, not by luck, not for a single hard year, but for generation after generation. So the real question was never whether survival was possible. The land already answered that. The question that should keep us here is far more unsettling. How did the people with the least outlast the people with the most? And the answer overturns one of our deepest assumptions. Because survival in a place this brutal was never about strength, never about resistance, never about suffering through the cold until it passed. It was about understanding. The most powerful technology on these plains was never made of metal, or stone, or even fire. It was knowledge. But to understand that knowledge, we first have to understand the force it was built to withstand. When most of us picture a killing winter, we imagine the blizzard. Snow falling in thick sheets, drifts swallowing the land, a white horizon where every direction looks the same. But the people of the Great Plains feared something quieter, something far more deceptive than any blizzard. They feared the ice storm. At first, freezing rain seems almost gentle. It falls like rain. It sounds like rain. It moves like rain. And then it touches a surface already locked below freezing. And in an instant, everything changes. Water becomes ice without warning, without delay, without mercy. Branches take on weight they were never meant to hold and snap in the dark. The open grassland hardens into a sheet of glass. Trails vanish. Water sources seal themselves shut beneath a lid of ice. The land doesn't simply grow cold. It grows closed, as if the whole world is being quietly sealed shut around you. And here is the truth that changes everything. The truth these families understood in their bones long before science gave it a name. Cold alone rarely kills a person. Moisture does. A dry body can survive astonishingly low temperatures, but the moment water enters the equation, heat drains from the body at a terrifying speed, and survival becomes a matter of hours. So imagine, for a moment, being inside one of those shelters at the height of it. It is the middle of the night. You hear it before you feel it. That soft, relentless tapping of freezing rain against the hides above your head, hardening layer by layer into a shell of ice. Your family sleeps close around a low fire, and the danger in that moment is not only outside in the storm, it is rising, invisibly, from within your own shelter. Because as your fire pushes warm air upward, that warmth meets the frozen walls, and it begins to weep. Condensation forms where nothing should be wet. Tiny droplets gather on the seams, on the inner coverings, and in that cold they turn to ice, silently attacking the very balance of heat and dryness that is keeping everyone alive. The enemy, it turned out, was never just the winter outside. It was the water hidden within. If the greatest danger arrived so quietly, then survival depended on hearing it long before it came. And this is where the people of the plains revealed something that still feels almost impossible to modern minds. Long before there were instruments to measure pressure, or charts to track a storm, they had learned to read the weather directly from the world around them. They noticed the small shifts most travelers would never feel. A change in the humidity that altered the very texture of the air. A turn in the wind that carried a warning no eye could see. The shape and movement of clouds gathering in patterns they had watched 1,000 times before. And above all, the behavior of animals, who grew restless and sought shelter long before any human sense could detect what was coming. To these communities, the land was never silent. It was speaking constantly, through pressure, through motion, through change, and they had learned its language. So when the signs aligned, the entire camp shifted, not in panic, not in fear, but in calm. practiced coordination. Because they lived by a truth we have almost entirely forgotten. Survival does not respond to urgency, it responds to preparation. The storm does not begin when the first drop falls. It begins long before it is ever seen. And here is what makes this knowledge so remarkable and so fragile. None of it was ever written down. There were no manuals, no diagrams, no books to consult when the sky turned. This was a living technology, carried in memory, and passed from one generation to the next, an elder speaking softly to a child beside the fire, teaching them what a certain wind meant, how to feel a storm approaching in the dampness of the air. Knowledge that took lifetimes to gather could be lost in a single one if no one listened. Now hold that against the settlers who came later. They arrived with maps of this land, with tools forged in distant cities, with confidence in everything they carried. But they did not carry the one thing that mattered most. They had the map, but not the memory of the land itself. And a map cannot tell you what the wind is about to do. All of that knowledge finally took physical form in something that looks, at first glance, almost too simple to matter. A ring of wooden poles rising into a cone, animal hides stretched across the frame, a small opening at the top for smoke to escape. It appears to be nothing more than a tent. But hidden inside that simplicity is one of the most overlooked feats of engineering in North American history. Consider what happens when wind strikes a flat wall. The pressure builds unevenly, concentrating in weak points, until something finally gives way. But the curved cone of the tipi does something entirely different. It doesn't fight the wind. It guides it, letting the force slide smoothly around the structure instead of slamming into it. What we now call aerodynamic efficiency was, for these people, simply the shape that survived. They had discovered a principle modern builders still rely on. Shape can give you more strength than thickness ever could. Yet the true genius was not in resisting wind. It was in mastering moisture, and they did it through a rule that governed everything. Control the moisture first, then control the heat. The secret to this lived in a detail almost no one remembers today. A second inner wall, a liner sometimes called a dew cloth, hung around the inside of the poles. As warm air rose from the fire and met that cold outer skin, the moisture gathered on the liner and ran harmlessly down to the ground, while the space where the family actually lived stayed warm and dry. It was, in effect, double wall insulation, the very principle behind our energy-efficient homes, achieved with hide and grass generations before we gave it a name. The fire at the center was never just a fire. It was a carefully managed engine of energy, tended so it gave steady, balanced heat, never too much, never too little. And beneath everyone's feet lay another layer of intelligence, because heat escapes downward into frozen earth just as surely as it rises. Layers of grass, woven mats, thick hides, and raised platforms trapped pockets of air and held the warmth in, so that the warmest place in the shelter was often not beside the fire at all, but wherever the insulation was managed best. And now the detail history almost always leaves out. Among many of the Plains nations, this entire system, the design, the raising, the maintenance, even the ownership of the tipi, belonged to the women. The engineers of this brilliant survival machine were the mothers and the grandmothers, and their names were never written down. But even the most brilliant shelter could not save a person standing alone, and this is where our final assumption falls apart. We love the story of the lone survivor, the single figure conquering the wilderness through sheer will. History tells a very different story. On the plains, individuals did not survive winter. Communities did. Everyone knew their role. Fuel was gathered and protected. Water was kept from freezing. Food was rationed. Repairs were made before they were needed. And the young, the old, and the sick were placed where the warmth gathered most. The tribe moved through winter as a single living organism, and this, perhaps, was the most overlooked survival technology of all. Not the fire, not the hides, not even the tipi, cooperation. And so we return, at last, to the question we began with. Why did the people with the most freeze, while the people with almost nothing endured? Now the answer is clear. The settlers arrived carrying objects, iron and timber and tools, believing that possessions were the same as preparation. The people of the plains carried something that weighed nothing at all and mattered more than everything, an entire system of understanding, of wind and moisture and heat, of shape and insulation and shared human effort, woven together so tightly that no single piece could be removed without weakening the whole. That was the difference between living and dying in the dark. They did not survive because they fought the winter harder than anyone else. They survived because they never fought it at all. They listened to it, they learned its language, and they moved with it instead of against it. And maybe that is the lesson that still reaches us today, as we fill our own homes with ever more complicated machines and slowly forget how to feel a change in the wind. Sometimes the most advanced technology in human history was never a machine at all. It was patience, it was attention, it was knowledge, quietly passed from one voice to the next, beside a fire, in the middle of a storm. Here at Dark Origins, we search for the forgotten wisdom that kept our ancestors alive long before the modern world began. If this journey moved you, stay with us and keep listening, because the past still has so much left to teach us.